Consequentialism is the view that the ethical assessment of an action or situation is determined by the consequences of that action or situation. Utilitarianism, the view that the moral assessment of an action or situation is determined by how much good results, is the paradigm of consequentialism. In the previous module, we looked at the essential features of utilitarianism, some reasons for endorsing utilitarianism, as well as some problems or objections to utilitarianism. I want now to examine more carefully some of these problems and the responses. Let's begin with the classic problem of the ancient Colosseum. Thousands of spectators have come to see a bloody massacre. A poorly armed, innocent person is placed in the arena with several hungry lions. Everyone knows that despite that person's desperate and pathetic efforts, he will be attacked and devoured by the lions. The spectators are in a frenzy of excitement, pleasure, and passion as they bet amongst themselves over how long the victim will last. I believe that most of us, if not everyone, will regard this scene as appalling and morally outrageous. But it would seem that the utilitarian would have to disagree. Doesn't the happiness and pleasure of all those spectators outweigh the loss of one person's life? Indeed, since the sum of the spectators' good is greater than the loss of good of the victim, the utilitarian is compelled to conclude that the action in ancient Colosseum is ethical. That is to say, the utilitarian seems forced to say that since killing the innocent results in so much more good in the form of happiness, killing the innocent is not simply morally permissible, it is obligatory, morally obligatory. But claiming that we are morally required to kill innocent people is outrageous. Have we, in this example, thus refuted utilitarianism? At this point, it might be worth noting an important methodological point. Hit-and-run objections might be effective on TV, in political campaigns, or at parties, but they have no place in a serious discussion or in discourse. It is important, therefore, to consider how one might reply to an objection, for only by thinking about possible replies can you get a better understanding of what is at issue. So, what can the utilitarian say? The utilitarian has two possible replies to the case of the ancient Colosseum. He could say, for example, that we should not feel outrage over his conclusion. If we do, well, that just shows our corrupt nature, that we don't appreciate the importance of the greater good, and so we let ourselves be distracted by the misery of one person when the happiness of so many others can be achieved. The problem with this reply is that it simply repeats the utilitarian conclusion, but adds nothing more. It simply repeats that the good of the many is more important than the good of the one. Anyone troubled by the utilitarian's view of the ancient Colosseum would not be reassured by simply repeating the utilitarian conclusion. A different reply is that the utilitarian could make to the ancient Colosseum case is to claim that the alleged calculation is incorrect. The happiness of those 1,000 spectators does not outweigh the life of the victim. This might seem like a plausible defense, but it then provokes the objection that simply increases the number of spectators. If 1,000 happy spectators isn't enough to outweigh the loss of an innocent's life, what about hundreds of thousands of spectators? What about 1,000,000? If no number is enough, are we saying that the value of a life is infinite? What would that mean for utilitarianism? Rather than pursue this idea of calculation, we can sharpen the objection by considering a different case, one that does not ask us to compare different kinds of goods, the value of a life versus the value of spectators' experience of pleasure. consider the problem of transplant. A healthy person goes to his physician for routine physical examination. The physician has several patients, some of whom are extremely ill and will soon die if they don't receive a suitable organ for transplantation. One needs a heart transplant, two need a kidney transplant each, one needs a liver transplant. The physician realizes that if he harvests these organs from the healthy patient who has just arrived, he will be able to save the lives of 4 patients, even though the healthy person will subsequently die. Because 4 is greater than 1, the physician performs the surgery. Most people would regard this case as outrageous as ancient Colosseum, if not more so. In this case, however, we are not comparing a life against the pleasure of spectators. We are comparing life against lives. How could the utilitarian reject the implication that in the case of transplant, it is morally required according to the utilitarianism? One reply would be to consider negative consequences in addition to the loss of the healthy person's life. For example, if such practices were well known, wouldn't people cease to trust physicians and no longer go for health checkups? Wouldn't that have bad health consequences for the population? Well, we can certainly acknowledge that some bad consequences would result from the transplant. But the problem for the utilitarian is the calculation. Are these bad consequences sufficient to outweigh the saving of 3 extra lives? One might argue that they do, because in the long run, more people will come to lose their lives because they will avoid health checkups. But even if we grant that the long-term consequences of the transplant are worse, the utilitarian response might still not be satisfying. Would we be comfortable with the thought that the only reason why physicians should not harvest organs of their healthy patients is that it would lead to loss of trust in physicians? Let's make some preliminary observations about the discussion of these examples so far. First of all, whenever we raise an objection, we must consider the possible replies. This is a lesson you must keep in mind when you do any of the assignments. The other objection is more specific to utilitarianism. We notice that by changing the specification of goods, changing what we mean by what the utilitarian calculates, the utilitarian seems to be able to avoid certain unpalatable conclusions. That is to say, unless prior restriction of what good or benefits are to be considered, the utilitarian seems often to have a way of avoiding the outrageous conclusion. This means that when you raise an objection to utilitarianism, you need to ask yourself whether the objection depends upon a particular specification of good. Okay, I now want to examine some other problems with utilitarianism. I've broken up this lecture into separate discussions that you can access on their own. Part 2 re-examines the non-utilitarian policies mentioned in the previous lecture. Part 3 examines the problem of utilitarianism and the distribution of goods. Part 4 examines impartiality.